Uh, there's only 66 people. Please call your friends. Please. It's already past 6 minutes. Okay, guys, are you ready? So we'll start. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Um, Edibe and Joshua, make sure your friends are there, okay? Because there are just 69 people. I think there should be somewhere above 70 people attending. Can I all see your
Okay, ma'am.
faces? Please just turn on your video for a minute. I mean, a second. Good to see you there. Yeah. Good, good. All right. So now, um, So now we'll start our presentation, all right? Can you see my screen? Can someone please tell me if you can see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. We can see.
Is my screen visible? Excuse me? Guys, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Something is wrong. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
All right,
ma'am.
all right. Sorry. There was some slight problem with my this thing. So you can see the full screen, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Cool. So now today your topic is on the classification of zoos and the classification of zoos and the management of protected areas. All right. So we're going to learn about that. What are protected areas and what are zoos and what are the classification of zoos. Now, I have rephrased the topic of the presentation to in situ and ex situ conservation. So can anyone tell me without using Google, anyone who knows the meaning of in situ and ex situ conservation?
Ma'am, in situ means like conservation and ex situ means away from the fight.
Great. Yes, that's very correct. Now, there are two main approaches. There are different methods of biodiversity conservation, all right? And different conservation methods can be broadly divided into two, which are the things that I have just told you, which are in situ and ex situ conservation. So in situ means within, inside the natural ecosystem. And ex situ conservation means outside the natural ecosystem. Okay? Now, these are the in situ conservation is the conservation of genetic resources within the natural ecosystem in which they occur, and the offsite conservation ex situ is the conservation of genetic resources. Okay, we would say genetic resources because everything boils down to that, right? Outside the natural ecosystem in which they occur. Now, what usually comes to mind when we talk of in situ conservation is protected areas, right? In situ within the natural ecosystem, equivalent to protected areas. And when we talk of ex situ conservation, what do we think of? Like what? We immediately think of zoos, right? But now I'm gonna give you a table here. I'm gonna ask you to look at it really carefully. I'm gonna use the pointer. Now, if we see this table, so even though we think that in situ means inside protected areas and wildlife sanctuaries, ex situ offside would mean where? Zoos, right? But as we can see here in the table, it extends to more than that. All right. So here we have the in situ, single-use wildlife management, scientific reserves, strict nature reserves, the national parks, monuments, heritage sites, all those things are there. And then there are areas other than wild lands. So these are the land converted, which are managed for genetic diversity. Can anyone have an idea about this? What area which is inside the natural ecosystem but would be areas other than wild lands that could be counted as in situ conservation? Can anyone tell me? I want to hear the ladies also, the ladies' voice. Okay, so I want the ladies to speak up as well. So anyone from the ladies, please answer this.
Biosphere.
Pardon?
Biosphere, ma'am.
Biosphere, right? You're saying biosphere?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, biosphere is a very broad umbrella term. It won't be wrong. Okay, but what I mean to say is that when we talk about in situ within the natural ecosystem, we see national parks like sanctuaries. For example, in Assam, in Arunachal you have Pake Tiger Reserve. In Mizoram we have Dampa Moorland. In Assam you have Kaziranga. In Sikkim you have Kanchenjunga National Park. So many. Okay, but those are the other than those wild untouched areas. What could be an in situ conservation? Have you ever heard of wildlife corridors?
No, ma'am.
So what a corridor is, right? A corridor is a walkway, it's a pathway, right? So wildlife corridors are such, are areas, are patches of lands where there is human settlement. Like for example, you have a protected area here. Okay, suppose you have a protected area here and you have a protected area here, and in between there are human settlements, right? So you cannot restrict the wild animals to completely you cannot restrict them completely just inside a protected area, because you know that they don't have borders, right? They have to walk around, to allow for the gene flow, to allow for their normal ecological behavior, right? So in such circumstances they build wildlife corridors, all right, so that it will enable the wild animals to move from one place to another. Okay, so you can see while constructing roads and all, people build underpasses and overpasses for wild animals. Have you seen this on TV? So those are the areas other than wildlands, okay, that are used for conservation. Now we'll talk a little bit about ex situ now. So ex situ, so when I talk about ex situ conservation, the thing that instantly pops up in your mind is zoos, right? So, but zoos are not the only ex situ method of conservation that are available. So the zoos and botanical gardens would be, preservation of whole organisms. But ex situ conservation can also be in organism parts such as sperm banks, embryo banks, organ banks, seed and pollen banks, tissue culture, gene banks, all these things can also be considered as ex situ conservation. Okay. But however, in this course, we shall be directly dealing with only zoos for ex situ conservation and protected areas for in situ conservation. All right. So now I'm going to talk about integrated biodiversity conservation and why it is necessary. Now, what is integrated? Integrated means combined. It means synergized. Okay, it means something that is combined and synergized. Now, we have to know that there is no universal method that can cover all conservation purposes. Okay, so in order to ensure the conservation of the widest possible range of biodiversity and to minimize the risk of genetic loss, the various conservation methods has to be combined in an integrated approach. Okay, so that is what we call integrated biodiversity conservation. Now, the method opted would depend upon the objective of the envisaged, the speculated or what you have in mind, the conservation, what you have in mind. And depending upon the severity and nature of the requirements, both the combination of ex situ and ex situ may be required to be applied. Like for example, currently we have the Great Indian Bustard project in India. So, the Great Indian Bustard, have you ever heard of the name? Yes, the Great Indian Bustard is a critically endangered grassland species of bird, which is found in some areas of the Western Ghats, Rajasthan, Gujarat, etc. Okay. Now, for this Great Indian Bustard project currently, they're doing an ex situ conservation, which is conservation breeding. They're collecting eggs from the wild and then hatching them and taking care of them in the conservation breeding center. And once they have enough, progenies and, all these are done scientifically, okay? All these are done scientifically. They are done in such a way that there is no inbreeding, there are no anomalies as such. So scientifically, that is all planned. And then after that, they hatch them, and after getting enough progenies, they will release them back into the wild. Okay, now the in situ conservation that is applied for the Great Indian Mustard Project is that not only are they doing the conservation breeding program, they are also protecting vast areas of grasslands like the Desert National Park in Rajasthan, which is basically there's a GIB, Great Indian Mustard Habitat. Okay, so that is a combination, an integrated approach of both ex situ and in situ conservation. All right. Now, why is in situ conservation, that is conserving biodiversity and species inside the natural habitats, why is it preferred? Now, it's because one reason is it maintains species in dynamic relationships with the habitat, and it allows gene flow, right? The animals get to choose who they mate, they get to choose where they roam, they get to choose where they, establish their territories and their geographical distribution. Now, all these factors allows evolutionary and ecological processes to take place naturally, right? Which is supposed to take place in the natural world, right? It's natural. Evolution and ecological processes are supposed to take place. Now, in situ conservation, it enables them to do it freely according to their ecological and natural behavior, okay? And it also promotes genetic variability and adaptability of species to changing environmental conditions. Now, also the costs, risks, and research needs of in situ conservation are generally low because mostly what you have to do is protect a patch of land, a wide patch of land, and then invest some amount for habitat improvement and manpower for protection, etc. So the cost, risk, and research needs for in situ conservation are quite low as compared to ex situ. And the conservation of biodiversity is best achieved in natural ecosystem, that is without doubt and without question. Okay, so it is the preferred method of biodiversity conservation. Now, if so, why do we need to integrate ex situ biodiversity conservation, the off-site biodiversity conservation, into this if in situ conservation is so much more preferred? Now, we need to know that we need to incorporate ex situ conservation because, as we all know, there is a lot of development in the world going on. Population is exponentially increasing, and because of all these, there are massive loss of natural habitats at an alarming rate. We have climate change, all sorts of things. We have mass amount of pollution and spill of oils in the oceans, a mass destruction of habitats that would encompass a lot of things. So I won't get into the nitty-gritties of that. But when I say that there's mass destruction of habitats, please, think a little bit wider, not only forests, not only lands, but also think of the marine and river ecosystems as well, all right? Desert ecosystems, all those things. They're all natural ecosystems. And because of the exponential increase in human population, there's massive development and there's massive destruction of these natural habitats. Now, in situ conservation, therefore, becomes not always feasible, okay? Where in areas where there's high environmental and human pressures. Now, the basic human needs, for example, we need agricultural land for sustaining ourselves for our food, right? We need vast patches of lands for raising animals for meat. All those kind of things makes conservation in natural habitats more difficult. Now, species or populations which we conserve in situ, that is inside their natural ecosystem, may be also susceptible to calamities or deliberate damages. For example, forest fires, okay, which may be natural or unnatural. Now, depending upon the level of disturbance we have in that particular area. Now, as such, in situ conservation is not always feasible for threatened species, especially due to all these factors. So that's why we have structures and methods for other means of conservation like zoos. Okay. Now, what is a zoo? A zoo basically is an institution for keeping animals outside their natural habitats inside designated enclosures. All right. So next class, I think you'll be dealing with the housing and the planning of zoos and all. So I won't go into that. But I just want to let you know that a lot of zoos that especially in my time when I was a kid, when we went around zoos, in different states, when we went for vacations and all, we'd see them in like, just normal cages, okay, steel cages. But the management of zoos and the designs of zoos also have evolved a lot due to ethical reasons and due to, the welfare the favor in welfare of the animals that are housed in the enclosures as well. So, right now, a lot of zoos have, incorporated modern designs, like, that are closest to its natural habitat, so they're not just kept in steel cages per se. So now they have a much better enclosure, much better zoo designs have come up. So you'll deal with that in the next class. It's there in your syllabus, so I won't be dealing with that today, all right? So now we'll go into the classification of zoos. Now, there are different types of zoos, among which we follow this classification in India because other type of zoos such as petting zoos where you can go and touch the animals are not allowed in India, all right? So zoos are classified into large, medium, small, and mini. These classifications are based on the area of the zoo, the number of the visitors, the number of species and animals, and the number of endangered species which are housed, okay, in its collection. Okay, here as you can see in the table, for a large zoo, the area of zoo in hectares minimum has to be 75 hectares. Now the visitors in a year can be minimum 7.5 lakhs. Number of species, different types of species should be minimum 75. Number of animals, minimum should be 750 animals. Number of endangered species should be 20. Number of animals of endangered species should be minimum 100. Now, in Aizawl Zoo, where you most probably would be going for your practical exams for the CLSC students, and in Nagaland, I haven't been to the zoo in Nagaland, though I have been to the zoo in Manipur. So that is near to Nagaland as well. Maybe you can go and visit that zoo. So in Aizawl, we have the mini zoo, okay, because it falls under these category, okay? So we have to categorize it into a mini zoo. Now, in a mini zoo, apart from these qualifying criteria, based on these categories, there are a number of things that, the category defines a number of things. Like, for example, how many veterinarians should be there, how many animal attendants should be there. All those kind of things are defined by this category, all right? Now, we will go to the ancillary programs and structures or centers that may be associated with a zoo. One is the Conservation Breeding Center. The Conservation Breeding Center, as you know, is a place where we do conservation breeding, that we breed animals outside their natural habitats. We take them on a scientific, with scientific methods and applying scientific technology for bringing up their numbers. All right, these are done for endangered species, and they are carefully selected. So each zoo throughout India have their own conservation breeding centers attached to the zoo. Like I said, in Aizawl Zoo also you will have the conservation breeding center for the Huluk gibbon. So they have had successes breeding there. They had also done conservation breeding for Mrs. Hume's pheasant, which is the state bird. And if I'm not mistaken, they have done conservation breeding successfully, and also they have done conservation breeding for the Asian tortoise. Okay, so all these things you can go and see there in the Aizawl Zoo. It's very interesting. There will be a lot of things to learn. And if ever I get to come home for work or for vacation, then if your course coordinator or some other your dean or someone permits, then we can all go and visit the zoo or some sanctuary if it's possible. So you can take up that initiative to get those permissions. Now we also have interpretation centers. Interpretation centers are also usually attached to zoos and also national parks and sanctuaries. So these are actually buildings. They'll have a building in which you can see all sorts of illustrations and figures and all those kind of things that will help you better understand what are displayed or what in the zoo, or what are the species in the protected areas and their natural behavior. So it's basically meant to educate people. Now also these museums are also usually associated with zoos. Sometimes they're usually incorporated into the interpretation centers. So in museum you can see all those preserved preserved carcasses and animal parts that have been confiscated, all those kind of things. Okay, and all those important parts of animals like the antlers which have been shed, all those kind of things can be seen in the museum. And also maybe some natural history facts and historical items that belongs to the state can be seen in these museums. Okay, so visiting interpretation centers and the museums and the conservation breeding centers usually requires a separate permission, but visiting interpretation centers and museums when you visit the zoo, that is a must. Okay, because it holds a lot of information. Now we will go to the acts and rules related to zoo animals. Now there are variety, like different rules and regulations that will pertain to protecting and in regards to the welfare of the zoo animals. First, we have the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960, which is not only related to zoo animals but domestic animals and wild animals as well. Now we have the National Zoo Policy in 1998. We have the Indian Wildlife Protection Act in 1972, which is a must, which is an act which you need to thoroughly go through if you want to become a wildlife veterinarian, or in fact even if you are a vet in the government also, because most times government veterinarians also have to deal with this wildlife cases, especially illegal trade and wildlife crime. So it's important that you also get to know a little bit, at least the gist of this Wildlife Protection Act. Okay, and we have the recognition of zoo rules, and we have the guidelines for establishment of new zoos under Section 38H in the Wildlife Protection Act itself. Now we have the guidelines for different activities for zoos in India, which is in the legislation, guidelines, policy and strategy given by which have been published by the Central Zoo Authority. All right. I would advise you to download this guidelines for different activity. This legislation guidelines and policy, this one, and just take a good look at it, because you can't just say, oh, we need a zoo, so let's establish a zoo. No, you can't just say that. So there are different protocols which are to be followed, and those internal those sarkari protocols, those are different things. But apart from that, you specifically need to design your layout plan. Your management plan has to be there, your layout plan has to be there, and those things have to be approved by a special committee that are made by the Central Zoo Authority, and they have to say yes to your layout plan, etc. Okay, and only then you can establish the zoo. And there are different guidelines to be followed, how animals are supposed to be housed, what are the minimum requirements for housing for different species, the area required, feeding, night cubicles, display areas, all those things are given here. So it's very important that you take a look at this, all right? Now I'll go to the management of protected areas. Now, like I said before in the earlier class, we have different type of protected areas, okay? National parks, wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, and conservation reserves. Now, here you can see the arrow, right? The cursor. Can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So when you look at the numbers here, it seems like it's a lot, right? Like you have 104 national parks in India, 566 wildlife sanctuaries, 97 conservation reserves, 214 community reserves. So it looks like a lot. And when you look at the total area in kilometers square, it actually looks like a lot, because the total number of protected areas come to 981. And the total area in square kilometers is over 1 lakh, okay? So, but when you look at the percentage in coverage of the country, it's only 5.03%. So you can understand how that would be insufficient, all right? So the whole geographical area of India is this much. The forest cover as per FSI report is this much. And the percentage under forest cover is only 21.54% of the geographical area of India. And when we talk about forest cover, we just remember that these analysis are actually usually done by satellite imagery. So it might not be, the real green cover, the real forest cover might be a lot lesser than this. So as you can see, it's only 5.03% of the coverage of the country by the protected areas. So it seems quite, less, right? Compared to our population and the number of human habitation, the area of human habitation that we have. Now we're going to the management of protected areas. So you have the wildlife sanctuaries, you have the community reserves, you have the conservation reserves, you have the national parks. So, for example, let's say you have passed out, you've become a veterinarian, and whether you decide to become solely a wildlife veterinarian, or you have gone into the government service and you're posted somewhere in another district, or whether you choose to do your civil services and maybe you've become a forest service officer, Indian Forest Service officer, or a state service officer, that's all possible. So now how do you manage protected areas? So there are certain broad principles and certain things that you have to look into for good management of protected areas. So one is habitat management, all right? And another is protection. Habitat management just means that you manage the habitat. Like, for example, if the protected area is a grassland ecosystem, you maintain that grassland ecosystem. If it's a forest ecosystem or a mixture of forest and grasslands, maintain that, all right? And there's different ways to do this habitat management. You have to do it scientifically, and everything has to be done in consultation with environmental scientists, conservation scientists, wildlife scientists. So one is habitat management, and the next is protection, which means that the protected areas needs to have very good protection. Okay, so you need trained manpower for this. All right, you need a lot of manpower. You need good protection because there are so many poachers, so many hunters, illegal, people encroaching into the forest, taking forest products, not only for wild animals but also the wild plants. People taking all those endangered plants, endangered orchids, and also we hear a lot about that in Northeast also, right? People taking those endangered medicinal plants from the forest, they're taking away our orchids. So you can see that in the news every other day. So protection is really important. And next is the trained manpower, which means this is a very broad term. It could mean right from the people who are protecting, the wildlife guards, who are doing the patrolling for protection on ground. And it can, just excuse me 1 minute.
Sure, ma'am. Oh, yeah, man.
Okay. So can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So, trained manpower is a very broad term. Like I said, it could mean right from the people who are working on ground to people who are, to the scientists and researchers or biologists that are recruited or that are employed to, better manage the protected area. And it could also mean the managers as well, the forest officers and all. Okay, so that's a broad term. Now we have research and monitoring, which is really important because management of protected areas, like you cannot just have a protected area and say that yes, we're protecting this area, don't hunt, don't shoot. That's very important for conservation. But like I said in the beginning, with habitat encroachment, with massive destruction of habitats, all those kind of things, we need a scientific approach to conservation. Okay, so this management and research has to be gapped for having an optimum and for having a favorable conservation. Okay, for having a desired outcome from the conservation activities, we need to bridge research and management gaps. Okay, and also monitoring is extremely important. Continuous monitoring of animals. For example, I'll just give you one example. So in Sariska Tiger Reserve, all the tigers got extinct. All right, and so they did a tiger reintroduction. And first they introduced a few individuals, and they started introducing more individuals scientifically based on scientific methods, and the continuous monitoring of those animals are going on. Okay, so we have they have a few of them radio collared, and fortunately, I think it was in 2019, I went to Sariska Tiger Reserve to attend a course by Edinburgh, and I was in the team that happened to sight that radio collared animal. Okay, such a beautiful animal, huge. She was in her prime, and she was just feeding, and she had just done feeding, and she had a full belly, and she had a radio collar over her neck, and it was a very beautiful sight to see. She was just like, I think, 5 meters away from us, and it was a very beautiful sight. So continuous monitoring of animals like that they're doing by radio collaring or camera trapping. So those are extremely crucial things that you need to do for effective management of protected areas. Now next we have the wildlife health management, in which specifically veterinarians play a major role. because as we all know, because COVID-19 has given us so much information and so much knowledge to even the layman, right, about wildlife diseases and how diseases interact with human beings and domestic animals and wild animals, and how it's actually an ecological triad where it's transmitted from the environment, that is the wild, to human beings and then to domestic animals, and how all this transmission is possible. This circular transmission is possible. So veterinarians are specifically important in this because, like I said in the previous class, the interface between human and wild animals is increasing a lot. So there's a lot of overlap. Now we have the protected areas and we have the fringe villages. We call them the fringe villages because they're in the periphery of the protected areas. So usually when there's human settlement, we have animals with us, right? We have our dogs, we have cows, we have chickens, we have goats, we have cats. So usually in a lot of protected areas, these especially cattle and buffalo, etc., mithuns as well, they roam into the forest for grazing. They are let into the forest for grazing. So in such circumstances, there's a lot of chances for disease transmission to take place, and we have seen huge havoc just recently in 2015, 16, 17 in Mizoram and Arunachal as well. There is no proof of a spillover. Spillover means that the disease has jumped from humans to wild animals, or from domestic animals to wild animals, or vice versa. Okay, so there was no proof of a spillover, but it was speculated that it was a spillover. Now we had a huge havoc. A lot of sero, which is a goat antelope, died in Mizoram in the wild. We found a lot of carcasses with huge lesions, pock lesions on their faces, and it was a horrible sight to see, and it was very disheartening. And in Arunachal also as well, they have reported the very next year, they reported mortalities of goral. Goral, right? So they have reported the wild goats. Gorals are basically wild goats. So they have reported mass mortalities because of pox again in gorals as well. So recently in Gir, just last year, you have seen in the news also that there's a CDV outbreak in the Asiatic lions, which is the last standing population of Asiatic lions in the world, which I've mentioned in the earlier class as well. So a lot of things are happening, and in 2016. In 2006 or 16, I'm not sure, I'm sorry. So there was a huge, massive mortality. They died in thousands and thousands of saiga antelopes in Kazakhstan, and which was actually caused by the Pasteurella multocida bacteria. Okay, so there was a huge, these are land species, and there was a huge mortality of saiga antelopes, and it was very devastating for conservationists to see that, and all those things happen, and that was linked to climate change. So what they said was that, what the scientists found out was that these Pasteurella multocida bacteria, they are normal inhabitants of their nasal tract. All right, so they are there in saiga antelopes. It's normal for Pasteurella multocida to be there. They usually don't cause death, or they usually don't cause diseases, but due to the climate change, these bacteria have flared up in their nasal cavity. So much so that they have caused that much disease become pathogenic to the animal, and it caused a huge mass mortality of the saiga antelopes. Okay, so the role of veterinarians are getting more important. Not only when we talk about wildlife health, it doesn't always mean pathogens or diseases, but also it pertains to a lot of other things like accidents and keeping of zoo animals, and also rescue and rehabilitation when it comes to conflict. So a lot of times you must have seen these videos of leopards going into human habituation, tigers falling into village wells, and they get stuck there and they have to go and rescue them. So all those kind of things happen. Okay, so all these are are included in wildlife health management. So the role of veterinarians are getting more and more important. All right. And now next we have the visitor services, tourism and interpretation, which I have explained before, and tourism is self-explanatory, so I wouldn't go into the details. But when we talk of tourism, it would be good to understand that, tourism should also be managed. All right. So if I don't know if you know, but all these protected areas like, national parks, especially the famous ones, they have a tourism area and a non-tourism area always. Okay, so even if you go for a safari, please know that that is not the only area, that is not the whole area. You're not allowed to go to the whole area. There are non-tourism areas where humans are not allowed to go at all. Okay, so it would be just giving you this information for your knowledge. Now next are the resources and infrastructures. We need to have hospitals, we need to have rescue centers, we need to have good anti-poaching camps. In several areas they used to have anti-poaching camps in protected areas, so we need to have these as well, so that while these ground staff protecting the protected areas are doing patrolling, so they have a good place to rest and a safe place to rest. All right, all these things are really important, so these are the things to look into when you are managing a protected area. All right. Now, all these things are the things you have to look into, okay, that I have just explained to you. But how do we account for this? How is the efficiency of these points accounted for? All right. So we know that we need to do all those 6 or 7 points, and we know that that is crucial for a good management of a protected area. But how do we account for that? How do we make the manager accountable, or the department responsible accountable for that? So in India we have this system called the management effectiveness evaluation. All right. So India is among the select countries in the world that have institutionalized this MEE. I will call it MEE. It's management effectiveness evaluation. All right. It's one of the select countries in the world that have institutionalized the MEE process. And India has made a beginning in evaluating the management effectiveness of not only its protected areas and sanctuaries and tiger reserves, but also World Heritage Sites, okay, since 2003. Now, currently, the 2020 to 2021 cycle is underway. It's going on. And in this 2020 to 2021 MEE cycle, we are evaluating an MEE team is formed. There are 20 teams with around 5 to 6 members each, okay, for the whole of India. So in this cycle, we are evaluating 210 national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, all right? So we will be evaluating them. So fortunately, I am also made a part of this, one of those 20 MEE teams. So I'm part of the Nagaland team, I'm part of the Assam team, I'm part of the Mizoram team, I'm part of the Nagaland team as well. All right. So this process has started, and a few of the teams have done their evaluations in other parts of India, but due to the COVID, it was halted for quite a bit. And let's see if situation goes down, situation gets better, and maybe if I come to Nagaland, I'll get to meet all the Nagaland students as well. It would be lovely to meet you all. And if I come to Mizoram also, like I said, if you are interested, everyone who is interested, you can take the initiative and take it up, and we can have some field trips, or some field exercises, okay, or go to the zoos, and at least to the zoo, because that's a little bit nearer to Aizawl or Selesi. So we can go to the zoo as well, or do something like that. That will be helpful for your cause and your knowledge. Otherwise, like I said, anyone who is interested during your summer vacation or whatever, you can always ask for an internship. We have some work running there in Aizawl as well, and it would be good to have some interns and all from your side also, so that you learn, you get to have some experiences on wildlife from your earlier stages of your veterinary career. All right. So that is all for today. And I think I finished in time today. I'm not taking too much time. Sorry. I used to go a little bit overboard when I talk about wildlife because, it's something I'm really in love with. So is there any other question or anything that you would like to ask? Okay, so I see there's a lot of... Okay, so Baboon World has asked, what is a wildlife safari? So there are two types of safaris actually, which you have to know. Please don't confuse them. One is a safari park, okay, which usually they keep inside the zoos. Now you'll have the safari parks in places like Banarghata Zoological Park, because over there they have a rescue center. And the rescue center are managed in a huge enclosure, okay, which is mostly very close to its natural habitat. And inside that you can go for a safari. But these animals are not in the wild, okay? They are actually maintained inside a huge patch of land, but they are caged, okay? They are fenced. So that's a safari park. And a normal wildlife safari would be like the safaris you see on TV, especially you see a lot of Africa videos on TV, right? Africa national parks. So it's like, you go to a national park and they will have a safari system. You have to book the jeeps, and then you go on the jeeps and then you go around, they drive you around and see the animals and the birds, okay? So that's a wildlife safari. And the second question is, how is the habitat of animals maintained in zoo? So like I said, I think in the next class you'll be learning about this. So they have to be maintained in the closest natural habitat as possible, okay, as close to its natural habitat. You cannot just keep them in a cage. So like, for example, if you're in Salesi Veterinary College, I would advise you to go to the ISO Zoological Park, because like over there, for example, you'll see that the animals are, for the Sero and the Goral, they have maintained the enclosure in a steep area of the zoo, okay, and they have been fenced there. So just like that, you need to maintain the habitat as close to the natural habitat as possible. And who is this Atul Kumar? Please don't joke during the classes, okay? I don't appreciate this. This is uncalled for, and this shows that, the lack of discipline. So please don't do this again, all right? You can do this on your WhatsApp chat or in your private chats, but please don't do it here in my class, okay? You can do it in someone else's class. Then Swapna Sahu says, how conservation reserve differ from national park and biosphere reserves? So this is actually just a matter of policies. So what I'd say is that it depends upon the protection, okay, the level of protection they have. Like, for example, a community reserve is protected by the community. It's inside the state, but protected by the community. But people are allowed to go and use the indigenous people are allowed to go and use, the villages are allowed to go and use the forest resources, okay, for the forest producers for their use. So the level of protection differs from classification to classification. So I mean from category to category. So that's how the difference lies. All right. Now Nishant Sharma says, when we put the animals in the zoo, does it support animal welfare? As you said, wild animals have no boundaries. Yes, I think this is a philosophical question. It's an ethical question, and preferably, like I said, it's better to maintain animals in the wild. And so when it comes to a question of ethics, then yeah, I don't think anyone would say that it's not cruel to it's okay to keep animals in the zoos. I don't think anyone would say that. But if at all we have to keep animals in the zoos, like for all the reasons I have explained, okay, in the beginning of the class, So those are all the reasons that we in ex situ conservation is also required. So if at all we have to keep them in the zoos, the principle we have to follow, that we have to abide by, is that we have to maintain the enclosures and the zoo habitat close to the natural habitat as possible. So you'll be learning a lot about habitat enrichment, feeding enrichment, okay, later. So in this, actually, for habitat enrichment, you make it as close possible to their natural habitats. For feeding enrichment, like for example, for bears, they just don't go and give the feed to them. They hide it under a rock, or they paint the honey on top of the tree, inside the enclosure, so that the animal will experience something that they usually do in the natural habitat, right? So all these things are scientific methods that are followed in the lab, in the zoo, to make it as close and to make it as ethical as possible for the welfare of animals. All right. So yes, it is possible to open a private mini zoo in India. We have a lot of private zoos in India. So yeah, but there are certain protocols and certain things that you have to follow, and permissions you have to get. So if at all you get all that, and you manage to get all this permission, then you can open a mini zoo. Now Rana says, in situ and ex situ conservation, how much genetic diversity is required to ensure its long-term survival? This differs from species to species. Okay, when you talk of genetic diversity, it's a very, how do I say, broad term. So I don't exactly know how to explain it, but it differs from species to species. So I cannot just say, okay, you need this much, okay? Because, yeah, so you need to know that by species. So you can read a paper on tigers, which was written by my colleague on the genetic diversity of tigers, okay? So I think you can have a more better understanding for this. And Baboon World said, what is Mithun? Is it a cow or a buffalo? No. Mithun is a genus of bos, like cow, but it is a domesticated, it's a cousin. I would say they're cousins, okay? So they are all of the same genus, but Mithun is a domesticated lineage of this thing. Boar, okay, the Indian wild, the Indian bison. So I think you ask your Arunachali friends, or you ask your Nagaland and Mizoram friends, they'll have pictures of Mithun. Okay, it's very important in our culture. It was used as a substitute for monetary exchange. Okay, so you ask your Mizo and Naga or Arunachali friends, a lot of people still keep Mithuns. Now, Atul Kumar says, is it against animal welfare to import animals to keep them in a zoo just for the purpose of sightseeing, like giraffe? So when you talk of animal welfare, I don't know, like if you say that is it illegal, it's not. If you have the right permissions, see, all these zoos are mostly under the state government, under the central government. So they all have these exotic species, okay? So like I said, in that book where I mentioned, the publication by the Central Zoo Authority, you'll find all these jurisdictions and all these regulations where how much exotic species you can take, how much endemic species, indigenous species has to be there. All those things will be there, all right? So you can read that up. So because all these exchange of animals, import, export of animals, if it's done illegally, it is possible. But when it's your personal ethical opinion, then that would totally depend on you. All right. And I have also my own opinions on that, which is not, I don't think it's a proper place to actually voice out for me right now. But it depends upon your personal ethics as well. But when it comes to legalities, then yes, If you follow the procedures, it's legal. Now, KP Kamei says, ma'am, this conservation reserve of wildlife, when did our country first realize to initiate? I think Kamei was not in the earlier class. Kamei, can you come online?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Were you in the earlier class?
Ma'am, I was not there.
Yeah, that's why. Okay. So I think maybe you had a problem with your network, so you couldn't be there. But please ask the presentation from your friends and please watch that. All right. So we have talked about all this. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
So Rana is saying the same question about ethics and animal welfare, about keeping animals in zoos. So I think I've answered that. So, okay. Then there's Hishe says, how do you select state animal or national animal? Does it depend upon their rarity? So, you know, yeah, we have, I think it just depends on, I'm actually not sure. So I'm actually not sure. So I think it doesn't always depend on their rarity. Okay, like for example, the state bird of Mizoram is the Mrs. Hume's pheasant. It's not a very rare bird per se when it comes to Mizoram, and it's not always the endangered species or anything like that. All right. So I think it's a matter of what animal we are, like, as a matter of pride, you know. And I think it's decided by the state government or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I'll look into this and I'll tell you in the next class. All right. Kima says, is there anything such as mid-situ conservation, where some regions are inside the natural ecosystem whilst other parts are lying outside at the same time? So, no, like it would be, yeah, I mean, you can, no, there's no term as mid-situ, but for example, in national parks, we have the buffer areas and we have the core areas, okay? The buffer area is the area surrounding the core area. They're all a part of the national park, but then in the buffer area, the protection is slightly, you know, they are slightly lenient. Okay, it's slightly lenient. It's less stricter. So you could say that, you know, it's like, oh, mid-situ. Okay, so it's like that. So what are the legal duties of veterinarians in zoo habitat management? So legal duties of veterinarians in zoos would be, like for example, you know, a lot of zoos have rescue centers attached to them. So when all these cases come, I think it's very important for the zoo. And also when an animal dies in the zoo, you have to do the post-mortem and give the report, you know, and every animal is to be accounted for, okay, when, especially when they're endangered animals, or, you know, so that's very important. And for the habitat management, yes. So I mean, for all these things, they're going to come to the veterinarian and ask them for their opinion, okay? Ask them for their technical expertise, okay? For their technical advice on how to maintain or how to build the best habitat for these animals in the zoo. So it's really important that the veterinarian knows all this, all right? And Nishant Sharma says, is there any internship programs in zoo for veterinary students? Yes, definitely. So I would like to advise all of you this. For us, no one, you know, there was no one who told us this. So if I had known this when I was a student, then I would have very much loved to do internships all around, especially during the vacations and all. So what I realized is people from other parts of the country, the students from other parts of the country, during their, you know, summer vacations or winter vacations, they ask for internships, you know. So search for people, search for zoos, search for the veterinarians, you know. All these organizations, institutions, and zoos all have their official website. The emails of the people or the veterinarians or officers responsible are all there. So it's, you have every freedom to contact them and write to them and ask them for internship. All right. Or as a volunteer also, so all these things matter. Getting a certificate later and say that you have volunteered for that, you have done this work. So all these things matter in your career. Okay. So I think you can start writing to all these people and ask if there is any opportunity or any chances that you would get, to volunteer or as an intern student. So you can completely do this. Like, you have the complete freedom to do this. Okay. So I think that is all. So is there any more questions? All right. Okay. Thank you guys. And thank you for all of you for the question. All right.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
And next time I would like all the ladies of the class to, also participate. All right. Okay. Bye bye,
Thank you,
guys
ma'am.
and girls.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.